Blizzard has been rolling out some big changes this week on the War Within beta, mostly pertaining to Mythic Plus. Some of these have been really good, and some have been confusing. Hi, it's Llarold, and I'm going to talk about what Blizzard's up to with Mythic Plus in Season 1 of the War Within, but first, don't forget to like and subscribe. Alright, now since there was a weekly reset, another weekly update, there are some things I want to go over with tank changes, just some very basic stuff. The first one is that there was a small update to this talent here for Sand Lane for Blood. I think this is worth mentioning because Sand Lane is, if we're looking at hero talents across all the tank specs, Sand Lane runs a very real possibility of being the most popular one in the entire game as things are currently tuned and built. And so this talent, Infliction of Sorrow, was changed just to kind of cover how it worked before. When you would Vampiric Strike an enemy, when you didn't have Gift of the Sand Lane up, that's Gift of the Sand Lane is this talent down here at the bottom. When you have Vampiric Blood or Dark Transformation, if you're playing Unholy, you have Gift of the Sand Lane. So when that's not up, the way it would work is it would make your Vampiric Strike procs chew up all of the remaining disease time on the target from Virulent Plague or Blood Plague, and then do twice that much remaining damage to that target as single target. And then when you had Gift of the Sand Lane active, it would, instead of doing that, instead of chewing up all of the remaining disease, consuming it, and then doing a bunch of extra damage, it would just extend the disease. And so you sort of had this back and forth play style of, during Gift of the Sand Lane, you just want to basically yam on Heart Strike or Scourge Strike to extend that disease way out to a super long time. And then the next time you get a Vampiric Strike proc, you smack them with a Vampiric Strike, and it consumes that gigantically long disease, doing a huge pop of damage. But you were reliant on actually getting Vampiric Strike to proc at some point outside of Gifts of the Sand Lane in order to do that. The way it's been redesigned here is now, instead, it just, whenever it hits an enemy, whether you're in or outside of Gift of the Sand Lane, it will do the duration extension and then do 20% of the remaining damage. But for the first one after Gift of the Sand Lane ends, your next Heart Strike, your next Scourge Strike, the very first one you do will consume the disease and do 200% of the remaining damage to the target. So you still have basically the same play style, but you're able to guarantee it one time after Gift of the Sand Lane ends, instead of kind of getting this all the time over and over again and sort of having a runaway burst damage situation. So I think this was maybe some kind of scary scaling that they were worried about, and they have backed off a little bit, but also made it a little bit more reliable. They also added in Carnage. Now, technically speaking, this was in last week, but they didn't mention it in the patch notes. But the choice node of Consumption or Blood Drinker was swapped from being down here at the bottom, kind of in the middle, to here at this sort of junction node where you can kind of use it for pathing, maybe, although, we still don't know what this talent here is, but obviously here we have Tombstone, and you're definitely going to want to take that. So with that being said, Carnage was implemented. It's a 1.1 procs per minute as it's currently built. That is going to be scaled by haste a little bit, so, you're going to get maybe 1.5 procs per minute with how much haste you're going to be rocking as a Blood DK, and it makes it so that both Blood Drinker and Consumption feed into your Mastery, so that does make Mastery a little bit more valuable. Not crazy, though. And it makes it so that anytime an enemy strikes your Blood Shield, not Bone Shield, Blood Shield, the cooldowns of Blood Drinker and Consumption have a chance to be reset. Now, playing around with this on a training dummy, it took a while to reset. That 1.1.5 procs per minute proc rate felt about right. You do actually have to have that Blood Shield active from Death Striking or using Blood Drinker or Consumption. So I don't think this is an amazing talent. But on the other hand, the potential to get instead of 2 Consumptions or Blood Drinkers per minute, 3 or maybe 3.5 is actually pretty decent. And, when you look at some of the competition down here, it's there's some really good talents down here, but, this is maybe one of the ones that can, more consistently increase your throughput in single target compared to stuff like Umbilicus Eternus, right? So I think it's a pretty decent talent so far. I just really want to know what this still remaining talent is to kind of evaluate everything else based on that. All right, maybe more significantly in the realm of tanking, Druid of the Claw Druid has seen a pretty significant buff for both Feral and Guardian. Aggravate Wounds makes it so that attacks increase the duration of Dreadful Wounds by a significantly longer amount of time, up to 8 extra seconds, and we'll show that off here. So Dreadful Wound is the bleed that you get from ravaging an enemy, whether you're Feral or Guardian. You ravage, you apply that Dreadful Wound, that bleed that is not affected by Circle of Life and Death, does a pretty significant amount of damage and also reduces the enemy's damage to you. Aggravate Wounds is this talent down here with a very messed up tooltip that just says every 0.60, 0.6 seconds up to 8 additional seconds. What it's supposed to say is when you use abilities on an enemy that is affected by the Dreadful Wound, it will extend the Dreadful Wound, basically going from 6 seconds of uptime all the way up to 14 seconds. That does help compensate for the very poor proc rate on Ravage, but still isn't great. But that is also being fixed somewhat in, the most obvious kind of way by increasing the chance for Ravage to proc in the first place by 30% too, which I think is pretty good. Guardians also have its Ravage damage increased by 20%. This is definitely what Blizzard needed to do. And then all of these other things as well. I think it does make it go from being like the worst hero spec in the game to kind of boring, but not actually that bad. There was one pretty significant change to Brewmaster monks, and I wanted to just go over that now. For the Shadow Pantry, this is also true for Windwalker monks. Generating flurry charges was changed from being a percentage of your health, which they had said they'd normalized and made it so that it didn't incentivize like using fortify or not using fortifying brew, not like using stuff that it would increase your health. Basically, they said they're not going to make it so that you're punished for having more health, but it did basically punish you for having more health. So they've just changed it to be scaled based off of your attack power. When you do 350% of your attack power, you generate a flurry charge. Playing around with this on some training dummies, there are some bugs with the training dummies, so it was a little misleading, but basically every keg smash in AoE, you're gonna get like 2 charges. I think that's pretty normal. So you're gonna very easily be at 10 stacks of flurry charge every single time that you spend 400 energy and trigger those flurry charges. It's gonna be, it's gonna be 10 flurry charges every time. Now, this still has some of the problems. Wisdom of the Wall here is kind of a perfect example of this. Every 10 flurry strikes, there's like a queuing issue with this, where if you run in and you just blast something with 10 flurry charges, this Wisdom of the Wall will proc after the 10th flurry charge. So, if you get that 4th or 3rd bonus down, flurry strikes deal AoE damage, that will trigger after the 10th one, meaning that none of the ones that you've just triggered would actually do AoE. So you would need to spend some time before you go into a raid or Mythic Plus, queuing up 9 flurry charges so that you're sitting at 9, so that the first flurry strike that you proc will trigger that bonus. And then from there on throughout the rest of the dungeon, as long as you're always getting 10 flurry charges every time you trigger flurry strikes, then you'll always get Wisdom of the Wall to proc on the first strike of the flurry strikes proc. It's complicated and not very good, and clearly the issue is just this sort of weird spell queuing that the fundamental construction is not great. Tying it to spending energy is not great. Tying it to dealing enough damage in order to generate flurry charges is not great. Tying this to spending 10 flurry strikes is not great. There's a lot of problems with this tree. And with all of that being said, maybe a bit like the Druid of the Claw Druid tree, I don't actually think it's bad numerically. I think it's quite good. I just don't like the concept very much. I think there's a lot of stuff in here that really doesn't make sense. All right, now let's move on to Warriors. Warriors have gotten a small change to some class stuff, and then more significant changes to arms and to Fury. Very little to protection, but a little bit of a change to Mountain Thane. So first off, Honed Reflex is this talent over here that previously would reduce kind of the main cooldown for your for your rotation, Shield Slam, and then also Pummel by I think 1 entire second has been changed to affect Shield Wall, Pummel, Intervene, Spell Reflection, and Stormbolt, and it reduces their cooldowns by 5%. So if we look at Shield Wall, 180 seconds, 5% of that is 9 entire seconds. 20-second cooldown on Spell Reflection, that's 1 second. It's not a huge talent here. I guess technically speaking, it's better than 0-second cooldown reduction, but arguably in a lot of situations, it's probably not going to be game changing to go from a 20-second cooldown to a 19-second cooldown. But if that situation arises, then this is a good talent. But I think for the most part, this is going to be pretty much a non-factor. If it were 10% cooldown reduction, maybe you'd notice a little more, but as it is, whatever. Sudden Death can now stack 2 times. I think that's pretty nice for all 3 specs, really, since all 3 specs do have Sudden Death available somewhere, and it is pretty nice to be able to have 2 stacks of that instead of just 1, having it, become this urgent priority the moment that it triggers to consume it before you accidentally overwrite a proc. I do think that's pretty great. And then Shockwave has had, visual clarity update, Thunderous Roar, visual clarity update, that's fine. Mountain Thane has had some very minor changes, nothing really all that substantial. Call of Thunder was renamed to Crashing Thunder. I'm guessing that conflicted with like some sort of shaman or boss ability name, so they just wanted to like clarify that. They slightly reduced the damage to Thunderclap for protection, but they increased the bonus of Thunder Blast, which is the modified Thunderclap proc that you get off of Shield Slam or Bloodthirst hitting. And, a bit of a change, bit of a buff for Fury, but, generally speaking, stays about the same for Prot, slight buff for Fury. I would say the main change for Arms is that Cleave now replaces Whirlwind, and Cleave has a longer cooldown, kind of alleviating some of the high level of pressure that was going on with Arms' rotation, which I will say I did feel like Arms' rotation was a little overwhelming compared to a lot of other specs, so I think that's probably for the best. Fury's had some significant reworks to their talent tree, but maybe the main thing I would say is like anger management is providing less cooldown reduction, and also just straight up 15% more ability damage and 10% more rampage damage on top of that. I think those were both needed. Fury really felt like I was hitting, I felt like I was dual wielding pillows, so I do think that's a good change. Protection, very small change, really just a change to this node down here. Dance of Death was slightly redesigned. I still think it's completely worthless. And Storm of Steel is now in a choice node with Dance of Death, but again, I don't think you're ever going to take either of those 2 talents. I can't imagine a scenario where either of those 2 talents is going to be worth taking over stuff that is available elsewhere in the tree and competitive for points. All right, now let's move on to dungeons. And Blizzard kind of has now laid out their plan for dungeons in Season 1 of the War Within. Now, some of this, they always say that they're happy to get feedback, and I'm definitely happy to give it. Some of this stuff is probably already set in stone. I think the dungeon selection, for example, is set in stone. I don't think any amount of feedback is going to change that. You might as well try arguing with the tides, but I still want to give my feedback and be old man yelling at Cloud, because I think the dungeon choice in particular is pretty problematic. So let's just start with what they have changed from Season 4, and it's very, very small. The only real thing that's changing from the way that they're currently running things in Season 4 is that normal dungeons will always be the 8 War Within dungeons, and then heroic dungeons, as well as Mythic Zeros, will be the same dungeons that are in the Mythic Plus dungeon rotation. I think their idea here, as they say somewhere in here, basically is to give people some practice, transitioning from like doing baby normal dungeons to level, but then doing some heroic dungeons, starting to gear up a bit, get more comfort, do Mythic Zeros, same deal, get more comfort, and then transition into doing Mythic Plus. I think this is a good idea. I do think this is smart. I think this is better than having, a completely different set of dungeons for like normal and heroic and Mythic Zero from the Mythic Plus dungeons. That wouldn't really make a lot of sense. What also doesn't make sense, I think, is the selection of Mythic Plus dungeons that they've gone with for Season 1 of the War Within. They're taking Stone Vault, Dawnbreaker, Arakara, and City of Threads, 4 dungeons from the upcoming expansion. Totally reasonable. Totally on board with that, and I do think that doing 4 new dungeons and 4 previous dungeons that have been updated, that was something they did in Dragonflight. I thought the core concept worked well, but I think they really need to be emphasizing fan favorites. There are literally hundreds of dungeons in World of Warcraft, and going back and really hitting on fan favorites, I cannot stress that enough. Ones that people like is the way to go here. There are so many that people like. And so choosing Siege of Borealis, my pick for maybe worst dungeon of all time, what interesting call. You have the first boss who fixates on people and is pretty hated. You have the second boss that jumps away to a boat and takes forever to kill and is pretty hated. You have the third boss who patrols around a room full of trash, and that part of the, setting up the boss is pretty hated. And then you have the fourth boss who is universally despised because it is like basically a vehicle fight where you have to clear out tentacles and activate cannons, and you're not actually engaging with a boss. So, like, really awful dungeon in terms of the bosses, but also I went and ran through it just to remember, like, how long is this dungeon? Is it as insanely long as I remember? Is the trash as brutal as I remember? Yes and yes and yes. It took over 6.5 minutes just like running through on a mount to get through this dungeon. The bosses were just as bad as I remember. The trash pulls are very large. Just, I think, a colossal mistake of a dungeon to bring back. Now, with that being said, Mists of Tir-Naseath, or Scythe. I wouldn't listen to NPCs saying the name. I've been calling it Mists of Tir-Naseath this whole time. It's Mists of Tir-Naseath, even though that's not how you spell Scythe. Good dungeon. I like it. I remembered it pretty well. Kind of a big fan. I think people are not going to be thrilled about going back and doing the Mistcaller maze and Mistcaller fight. Not thrilled about that, but I do think, generally speaking, it's going to be a favorite of the season because it's super fast. And also, Blizzard has announced that they've made the small change to it, that instead of needing to be Night Fae, you can just be Tauren, High Mountain Tauren, Night Elf, Druid, or Herbalist in order to interact with all of the Vine Gates and the checkpoints and so on. They probably should just make those checkpoints automatically activate. I think that's clearly how it should work, but that's not the direction they've gone. So, they're committing to that same bad Shadowlands design, but now switching it over to like racial, class, and profession-oriented bonuses instead of just getting rid of the situational checkpoints entirely. Necrotic Wake is another dungeon that I'm not really that thrilled about going back to, but they have announced again that they are planning to disable some of the things that I didn't really care for in that dungeon, such as the malfunctioning Goliath and the Forgotten Hammer. Those are just going to be disabled and removed entirely. The Bloody Javelins are going to, instead of being this like insane burst of damage that immediately rips threat, they're going to turn into more like a stacking damage taken bonus on enemies, which again, I would be fine with them just being removed. I've never really liked the idea of items and NPCs that you can like mind control in dungeons that you then use to power through the dungeon. I kind of want to play my character and engage with the content by playing my character through it rather than using mechanics that are like bespoke for a single dungeon to trivialize stuff. But I think they've done a decent job of hedging their bets here because some people really love that. Some people would be really upset if the Bloody Javelin and the discarded shield and all that stuff didn't at least exist in some form in this dungeon. So, it's fine. This stupid shield is no longer channeled, so it is actually pretty usable now, unlike how it was in the past when it was basically unusable garbage. And then the discharged anima, which admittedly the lieutenant, I can't remember his name, but I just killed him using the discharged anima while running through this dungeon again, just to kind of remember it. Having the discharged anima that does a ton of AoE damage and more importantly silences the caster pack that he's a part of. If that weren't available, that would make this dungeon dramatically harder. So I do think it's a good thing to have that still be available, if they're not just going to kind of remove that guy or nerf him into dust or something. Either of which would probably be a better idea than keeping the discharged anima around, but it is what it is. And then finally, Siege of Borealis, the one real change that they've made to this, I guess two changes, is that one, everybody's going to be forced to go through the Alliance version of the dungeon, which I'm not thrilled about. And then also the Ashvane Spotters, which were able to basically clear the dungeon for you, are no longer going to be able to damage enemies at all. Good change. I think, this is much more in line with, on the one hand, it's going to spotlight how terrible this dungeon is. It's going to really make people hate Siege of Borealis, which, is fine. I want people to feel the same way I do too. But on the other hand, it is going to make this dungeon be a real slog. It is really long. The trash is bad. The bosses are bad. It is a rotting spot on the rest of this season's worth of dungeons. And then finally, Grim Batal. It is a Kata dungeon, so I think that's a nice bit of a send up to the fact that they have Kata Classic happening right now. It's also a dungeon I kind of like. And, have fond remembrances of, so I'm okay with going back to Grim Batal. All right, now let's move on to affixes, and I think I'm going to start by just reading their little philosophy here, because I think this is kind of important for criticizing what it is they're trying to do here. Before we dive into the specifics of the new affixes, we would like to outline our goals and the purpose these affixes serve. Our overarching goal is to minimize the mechanical overlap between affixes and dungeon trash design in the current +4 affix bucket. This is a great goal. Getting rid of visual clutter, which I know they're about to mention, but getting rid of visual clutter is definitely something to aspire to. So here are their following objectives. Shift the source of challenge to the dungeon itself by simplifying affix design and emphasizing creature abilities. This is a great idea. Reduce visual noise, nameplate clutter, and the cognitive load on players during trash combat. Allow for varied and context-specific gameplay decisions depending on the dungeon they're applied to. Okay, so these first two objectives here really could be nailed down by just getting rid of affixes entirely. If you want to shift the source of challenge to the dungeon itself, affixes being removed is accomplished by doing that. If you want to reduce visual noise, nameplate clutter, and cognitive load, removing affixes accomplishes that. As for allowing for varied and context-specific gameplay decisions, I think having trash pulls that aren't all the same also fixes that issue. Additionally, these affixes will include a positive effect. This is great. I'm very happy to read that. Kiss Curse is a good idea. The aim of these positive effects is to highlight different damage types each week, allowing each specialization additional opportunities to excel during the season. Oh no. This is Blizzard's attempt to get rid of the locked-in one-class meta for entire seasons, and it is not great. These effects should feel like a bonus, offering an advantage for different damage profiles each week without being essential to complete a dungeon. Well, the thing about being essential is that once you've reached a certain point of pushing, 10% more damage for this class or that class is going to mean the difference between being able to go up a key level or not. And that is why I think what they've done is really going to be a miss here. And so now let's take a look at these new affixes. Non-boss enemies without mana ignore 20% of their attacks, but their armor is reduced by 30% and they take 10% increased arcane damage. That's reckless. So this is increased damage from arcane mages and about, half of Balanced Druid's kit. You have Thorned, non-boss enemies without mana inflict physical damage to their attackers when attacked, but take 10% increased Holy and Shadow damage. Now, we don't know exactly how much damage they inflict, but okay, Holy and Shadow damage, so that's like Ret Paladin, Shadow Priest, all of Af Lock, and then some of Demo Lock, and none of Destro Lock. Okay. Attuned makes it so that non-boss enemies with mana inflict 20% increased magic damage, which sounds pretty bad, but take 10% increased nature damage and 30% increased damage from bleeds. Nature damage would be Assassination Rogue and the other half of Moonkin damage and a good chunk of Shaman damage. And then finally, Focused would be, and I guess Bleed would be a combination of Arms Warrior, Prot Warrior, Feral Druid, I guess Guardian Druid, but barely, and Survival Hunter. And Focused then finally makes it so that non-boss enemies with mana have increased haste, which I actually think is significantly more dangerous than more damage. Just increased haste means harder to interrupt, a lot more challenging, but then they take 10% increased frost and fire damage. So the thing I look at here, and I think is kind of troubling, is mages are in great shape, right? You can go Arcane for Reckless Week, you can go Frost or Fire, and then spec Frost Fire for Focused Week, and you're fine. But there are a lot of specs, Enhanced Shaman, that are really never going to be able to take full advantage of this. They're going to get a little bit of nature damage week, a little bit of armor reduced week, a little bit of frost and fire damage week. They're always going to be second class citizens. This is an idea that basically creates a weekly rotating bench. And that is the overwhelming majority of the criticism I've seen of this thus far. And there's a reason it's the majority of the criticism. It's correct. This is basically a way to punish people for playing whatever their chosen spec is for 3 weeks out of every month. 3 weeks out of every month, you're going to do 10% less damage than the people who are playing the correct spec that week. That's pretty frustrating. I think there are so much better ways to make this sort of a kiss curse system, a rotating kiss curse system, more appealing by giving people increased haste, mastery crit, verse from week to week that could slightly skew the balance a little bit more. But just doing it this way where monsters take 10% more of one type of damage and, have some sort of weird positive bonus, shredding tanks, for example, not great. Also, I think it's worth pointing out here that Havoc Demon Hunter is going to benefit from all of this because they do so much chaos damage, and chaos just benefits from whatever type of damage the enemy takes the most of. I guess that's going to be somewhat true for Destro Lock as well. Destro Lock and Havoc Demon Hunter are just going to be absolutely feasting every single week. Then you have specs like Enhance and Elemental Shaman that are really never going to be able to take full advantage of any of this. I suppose the same is true for Balanced Druid as well, but for some reason I feel less sympathetic towards them than I do towards those Shaman. With this being tied to creatures having or not having mana as well, it's just like very arcane. It's very esoteric. I mean, I get what they're going for. Basically, sometimes it's auto attackers and sometimes it's casters, and it's sort of rotating back and forth, but it's just a very strange approach. And I really don't love this at all. Now, with that being said, they are retiring the following affixes: Afflicted, Incorporeal, Entangling, Storming, and Volcanic. And as for Afflicted and Incorporeal, all I really have to say is rest in piss, bozo. Two terrible affixes that I'm glad to see go. Entangling, Storming, and Volcanic, I could go either way on those, but they have pruned down their +7 affix bucket slightly to compensate, and that means they're keeping around Raging, Bolstering, Bursting, and Sanguine. Keeping Bursting, keeping Raging, I think these are okay. I mean, I would rather they just kill them off completely, but, you know, whatever. But keeping Bolstering and keeping Sanguine is crazy to me. You know, Entangling, Storming, and Volcanic are all much less oppressive and frustrating than Bolstering or Sanguine. And, you know, it's just a real disappointment that they're going to keep those two around. Now, since they are keeping Sanguine, at least at this point they are, that does to me indicate basically that like 4 of the 6 tanks are kind of getting a buff on that, because this does mean that Bolstering and Sanguine are going to be around more often. Every 4 weeks you're going to be dealing with Sanguine, and then every 4 weeks you're going to be dealing with Bolstering, you know? They're going to be up basically half of the weeks. So Sanguine, with being able to boop enemies out of those pools, I think Monk gets a pretty big advantage out of that. I think DK is the obvious winner on that, being able to grab stuff out. Demon Hunter being able to Sigil of Chain stuff out is also pretty valuable, and Druid being able to Typhoon stuff out or use Ursol's Vortex on the ground to keep CCable enemies in place and have them die while you move a non-CCable enemy out of the pools. Like, I think there's a lot of value for basically those 4 tanks, and then Pally with no way to knock back enemies, and Warrior with no way to knock back enemies, and in fact the only real things that they have are like the ability to stun enemies and root enemies. I think Warrior's the biggest loser here. Pally, you know, at least you can silence casters out of a Sanguine pool, so there's some value there. But Warrior's really feeling the hurt of Sanguine being an even more present affix. Really wish they would kill that in Bolstering. It's very disappointing that they're keeping those around. And then finally, Tyrannical and Fortified. They are maybe open to the idea of killing those off. They are saying that they're experimenting with how these affixes fit in with their updates. And, you know, I am hopeful that they kill these off. I think if they were to kill off Tyrannical and Fortified and then keep this sort of unfortunate new affix design and keep Bolstering and Sanguine around, I think I could live with that. Tyrannical and Fortified, I'm really not a huge fan. I really haven't been a huge fan since Legion, but I definitely think it is something that has overstayed its welcome. Now there is some suggestion that maybe what they're going to do is they're going to have both of them active at once, and that would be terrible. That would be really awful. So I certainly hope they don't go that route, but I guess if they do, you know, whatever, like, fine, okay, then that just means that Mythic Plus is just that much more proportionally difficult all the time, and then they'd probably tune everything down to compensate. And that really is the problem with both of them. They're just super duper boring. And that's kind of how I feel about these 4 new affixes as well. They're really not like that disproportionately different from Fortified and Tyrannical. The only real thing that they do that is like, I don't know, they increase the monster's damage basically, but they don't actually increase their health. And I think I can live with that. If I had to choose one of these two, I think I would rather have monsters that do more damage and don't have more health than have more health. Making the stuff take longer really is the most frustrating part. As I said, it's kind of a mixed bag. I'm pretty happy about some of these things. I like Mists of Tyrna Scythe coming back. I like Grim Batal coming back. I think the 4 new dungeons could be pretty fun. I am hopeful that Fortified and Tyrannical could be removed. That would be pretty great. But, you know, I'm not really all that thrilled with the 4 new affixes that they're putting in the 4 slot. I'm not thrilled with Siege of Borealis, and I really don't love that Bolstering and Sanguine are sticking around. All right, I think that pretty much covers it. Thanks for watching. Bye.